From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about the massive nationwide protests that have engulfed both Lebanon and Iraq. To discuss the situation, I'm joined again this week by Paul Salem and Randa. Paul is the president of MEI, and Randa is a senior fellow and the director of MEI's Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program. Paul, Randa, welcome back, and thank you for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Thank you, Alistair. Good to be here.
Let's start with the situation in Lebanon. As the week began, protesters and the government seemed to have reached a stalemate. Protesters had made their demands clear, calling for a clean sweep of the country's political leadership and the formation of a new technocratic government, while the governing coalition had offered a package of economic reform measures but refused to go any further. But then on Tuesday, Prime Minister Saad Hariri announced he was resigning, along with his cabinet, saying he'd reached, quote, dead end. Paul, where does this leave things, and what happens now?
Well, I think this is one important milestone in this historic uprising. If you want to sort of chart the milestones, one is the eruption of it all. Second, I would say, is the rejection of the reform promises made by the sitting government. And now is the resignation of the government. Certainly, it is a victory for the protesters. That was one of their core demands. It also has opened up political space, as it were, because the resignation effectively was accepted. So the president is now tasked to consult with parliament, as the Constitution says, name a new prime minister who then has to put together a government. So it opens up a space to try to form a new government. Obviously, the protesters, and I think a lot of maybe growing consensus among even the political class, is that they do need a different type of government. They do need either wholly or largely technocratic government of non-politicians, or at least not the old faces. So I think we are at a moment of, I don't want to say progress with a big P, but it does create an opening. It has also allowed a bit of an easing of worries and tensions. The banks will be reopening partially. That has eased economic sort of concerns one peg. Some of the schools are going to reopen and so on. So it might provide some minor pathway forward.
Randa, what's your read on the current situation?
I think they are at a stalemate. And the question is, okay, for the protesters, their number one demand has been met. So now what's going to be next? You know, when you follow and hear some of the protesters, not leaders, but some of the prominent voices within the protester group, you know, when asked about what is the next step, who is the prime minister you'd like to see, their response has been, well, it's not up to us to nominate names. It's not up to us to say who is supposed to be the prime minister or who are the cabinet member. It's up to the authorities to to give us the name, to ask to nominate people, and up to us to vet them in terms of expertise, in terms of their professionalism and non-partisanship. I think it's going to be hard, on one hand, for the system to act in a different way than it has acted. This is how the system works. It's a consensus among 5-6 men, and that has been, you know, the rule of the game now for decades. And now you have at least 1/3 of the Lebanese saying this system, these rules of the game no longer work. We need to change them. So in terms of what the protesters need, in terms of what the system is willing to offer in order to preserve its hold on power, because, you know, elites are going to resist giving up what they have. I mean, unless the protester can come up with a sustained long-term strategy of resistance and of putting pressure, a smart strategy of escalatory steps, and more importantly, developing a narrative that can convince the remaining 2/3 of the country that if protests continue, change will be achieved. There is a lot. I talk with a lot of people in Lebanon, people who are definitely sympathetic to the demands of the protesters, definitely share the same woes and difficulties that the protesters have been articulating and they share. But they say, okay, but then can we get to where they want to go? given the governing formula that we have. This is where things are. There is a lack of confidence in the government, in the ruling elite providing, but there is a lack of confidence in a large part of the Lebanese population, whether the protesters with their current strategy can deliver the change that everybody, all Lebanese agree is needed.
Paul, given the kind of broader economic concerns that you referred to earlier and the concerns among the protesters, how much time is there really to figure out what these next steps are? It seems like the political situation is going to be complicated. It's going to take a long time to unwind, but there's also this backdrop of economic tensions. And it just seems like a very complicated dynamic to figure out when, as the governor of the central bank earlier this week said, we're kind of days away from economic collapse.
Yeah, well, it's important to note we are already in economic decline. The word collapse, hard to define what that means. The collapse started several weeks ago, and it started before the protests. And the protests were partly a panicked reaction to a collapse that was happening in fast motion. The banks stopped giving out dollars. The ATM machines stopped dispensing money. The economy was beginning to contract. So this was happening. It is now going to be happening faster, no doubt, because of the uncertainty and the crisis. And a lot of the economic stability depends on confidence before anything else, just general confidence of depositors that they don't go for a run on the banks, on foreign lenders that they continue to cooperate, on the international community that continues to have confidence, on the expatriate diaspora community that it keeps its money in the country or comes to the country and brings its money back. So we are in a medium speed decline or collapse. What is urgently needed, and I think this is now recognized, is a quick formation of a fresh government, which will do two things at least. One, quickly give enough confidence to the protesters for them to, go home for now, in order to allow, all institutions to open and the economy to try to begin to pick up and restore confidence domestically. But more importantly and more critically, it needs to send an important international signal of confidence. That is important for two reasons. One, Lebanon does need an immediate show of economic support. Could be limited, but either the West or the Gulf countries, somebody needs to step up when we have a credible government to say, okay, we're going to be with you through this. We stand with you. We put our confidence to back your confidence. That could be in the form of a deposit, could be in the form of an aid package, but more the longer term is not so long, but to quickly that this government quickly institute some of the key reforms that would then unleash or free up the some of the $11 billion that was pledged in the CEDR conference in Paris. Those reforms relate obviously to governance, transparency, but also reforms in the electricity sector, the telecom sector, salaries, pensions, subsidies, and things of that nature. All of those things, of course, are difficult and not popular. And that is another challenge that any government will face. These measures are basically different types of belt-tightening measures, and those are never popular.
Randa, where does this leave the Hezbollah-Amal Aoun axis in light of the Prime Minister's resignation?
Look, I think the resignation now puts the ball in their court. And what Hariri has done is to put himself and his movement on the sidelines of this crisis. Basically, in a hedging position. He's no longer part of the governing coalition, although he's going to stay as a prime minister of the caretaker government. And on the other hand, he's not totally considered by the protesters as one of them, though he is seen by many as sympathetic to their demand, much more than Aoun, Hezbollah, Nasrallah, and Amal and Berri are. I think, as Paul said, there will be consultations with the parliamentarians, and there is high likelihood that Hariri will be renominated or retasked by the president to become the next prime minister. Now, increasingly within the Hezbollah circle, there is this view that is gaining ground that Although in the beginning, Hassan Nasrallah admitted that these are genuine protests with genuine aspirations. They are not, the protesters are not in the streets because they are funded by foreign embassy or are meeting for an agenda. But this is changing. This narrative changes. He gave a speech on October 25 in which he started qualifying or partially changing the narrative by saying, okay, part of the street seems to be led by foreign agendas, and that also of other local politicians who are trying to ride this wave for their own political purposes to settle scores with other politicians, meaning Aoun, meaning Lebanese forces, meaning Kata'ib. But on Wednesday, the spokesperson of the Iranian presidency issued a statement which comes after a similar statement by the supreme leader, in which he says that the protests in both Lebanon and Iraq are being instigated by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. So when this narrative starts taking hold, especially within a group like Hezbollah, that affects their calculus, that affects their what is their next move, and basically put them in a very much defensive position and feeling under attack, and make them even more recalcitrant in terms of any kind of concession making they will make. So I think as this narrative starts to gain hold, not only within the leadership, but also within the Hezbollah street and the Hezbollah constituencies, I see a possibility of even more protraction of this crisis, because an important group of this coalition, specifically Hezbollah and some Berri, becoming even more difficult to make any kind of concession that will be acceptable to the protesters.
Yeah, I think what's also interesting is that in a way, the three proxies that Hezbollah has supported to extend its influence in the Lebanese government, the Christian Michel Aoun and his nephew Gibran Bassil, Saad al-Hariri among the Sunni leadership, and Nabih Berri in the Shiite leadership, all three have been very wounded. Hard to say if they're mortally wounded, but they certainly have been gravely wounded by the events of the last 2 weeks. Michel Aoun's credibility as a president has collapsed. Gibran Bassil appears somewhat persona non grata in many regions of the Christian area. Saad al-Hariri was somewhat bankrupt to start with, but even if he's named again, he's finished, I think, as a major leader. Nabih Berri, maybe he was already old, but really it's clear that there is a significant discontent there. So Hezbollah, I think, is surviving just fine. The revolt was not against them, unlike 2005 to some degree. But where will the new leadership come from is a key question that faces the country, faces the protesters, maybe faces Hezbollah as well. And here, there's two dynamics. One is the new government, which needs to be put in place in a matter of days in order to shore up the economic decline and try to prevent an utter collapse. From that government might emerge some new figures, some new leaders. But the real challenge for the protesters, I would say, and given how many they are, it's almost, you could say, for the people, is to gear up for the next parliamentary elections. Because what's sad, in a way, is that all these leaders that the revolts have revolted against were recently elected by tens and hundreds of thousands of votes. Unlike other Arab Spring countries, they didn't, maybe Hezbollah puts itself by force, but the politicians are elected. So the real challenge will end up in the ballot box. And that's where a lot of Arab Spring movements have failed to translate multi-million people marches into electoral results. So I think I see that as the medium-term challenge, and whether elections are held early or on time, it's still a very short period of time.
I totally agree with Paul on this. And then we have seen, for example, in 2018, civil society gearing up for the elections, putting together fielding, quite a good number of candidates. And then eventually, because the electoral law, which was a little bit of an improvement on previous electoral laws, made it difficult for many of these candidates many of whom are part of the leadership core of this protest movement. It prevented many of these candidates from making it into the parliament, except for one person, Paula Yacoubian. But what's also interesting, and the kind of debate that's happening right now, at least inside Hezbollah base, I'm not talking the leadership, is there are now voices saying, maybe this whole experiment of Hezbollah being in government since 2005 has not reaped the kind of benefits to Hezbollah as people expected it. And second, that it has sullied its reputation, that it has put it, it has veered it away from its original agenda of fight movement for the oppressed, standing for economic justice, pushing against corruption, and that as long as you are in alliance with Aoun, Gibran Bassil, Berri, you cannot be seen as a credible voice against corruption. And so there are now voices inside the Hezbollah base, but also at the second tier level of the leadership of Hezbollah, basically who are saying, maybe this time we should sit it out. We should not be part of the government. We can help in the formation, but none of people affiliated with us, whether it's in technocratic cabinet like people affiliated with them, or whether non-technocratic government, people who are part of the lead of the Hezbollah, that they should not take part in the cabinet and see, how things proceed.
Let's move on to Iraq, where protests resumed last Friday on October 25th after a hiatus. Since then, the situation has escalated quickly, with a harsh crackdown by security forces resulting in hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries. In spite of this, however, the protests have continued to grow, with high school students and seminary students taking the streets in recent days. Randa, can you give us a sense of where things stand in Iraq?
Look, what we have seen now is a war of words and public messaging going on between the three pillars, if we can put it, of the regime in Iraq. Adel Abdel Mahdi, the prime minister, Muqtada al-Sadr, he is the head of the largest parliamentary bloc in parliament, and Hadi al-Amiri, the head of the Popular Mobilization Forces and also leader of the second largest parliamentary bloc in the parliament. And so what we have seen in the last few days is basically calls by Muqtada al-Sadr and former Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi on Adel Abdel Mahdi to resign. Adel Abdel Mahdi issues an 800-word letter to Muqtada al-Sadr, basically in which he says, if you want me to resign, all you have to do is go and talk with Hadi al-Amiri. You are the two people who put me here in this position. You lead the two largest parliamentary blocs. So just go and get a deal done, and I will resign if you can advance a vote of no confidence in parliament. Now, Adel Abdel Mahdi knows that even though that Al-Amiri and Al-Sadr lead the two largest parliamentary blocs, the two blocs, even if everybody in the blocs vote depending on the wishes of their presidents or of their leaders, they will not be able to get the 165 votes in parliament to force a no confidence vote. They will need, for example, the Kurds. And the Kurdish leadership, especially the KDP part of the Kurdish leadership, sees in Adel Abdel Mahdi the best prime minister in Baghdad they can ever have, And so they are sticking by him. And you had Masoud Barazani coming up with a statement a few days ago saying Adel Abdel Mahdi was appointed as a prime minister by legal means, and he cannot be forced to resign. If he were to be changed, it has to be also by legal means. There are now ongoing meetings between the three presidencies, Speaker of the Parliament, the President, led by Barham Saleh, the President, and the Prime Minister, about the pathway forward. I think the turning point in this conflict has been the Karbala massacre. We don't know yet how many people died in this. Some report says it's 13 people, 18 people. Some people say even more, hundreds of wounded. And that seems to be the point of no return for the protester as far as the resignation of the cabinet. And it's interesting to compare Iraq and Lebanon. When you look at the platforms of the protesters in both cases, it's pretty much the same. Resignation of the cabinet, of the government, appointment of a technocratic cabinet, early elections, new electoral law that moves away from the sectarian apportionment of parliamentary seats, sitting of a new parliament, election of a new president, and appointment of a new prime minister. Is exactly the same pathway that both sets of protesters in both countries have been advancing.
Paul, I wanted to get your read on that as well. It seems like one of, as Randa laid out, the similarities are very clear there. And the Iraqi government has also proposed wide-ranging reforms. The protesters seem not to find those credible. It kind of goes to this longstanding issue of the credibility of the ruling elite. In these kind of circumstances, how do you go about bridging that fundamental gap in trust between the people and the government?
Well, I think, first of all, when you step back a bit and look at interesting perspectives, in a way, you could say this is the third wave of the Arab Spring, if we wanted to call it that. In 2011, we saw that first wave. 5-6 months ago, we saw what you might call a second wave in Sudan and Algeria. And we are now kind of having a third wave. Iraq has been through these massive protests several times already. But it's interesting that this wave is in two peculiar countries, one might say, which is Iraq and Lebanon. Both have power-sharing systems. Both are very sectarian. Both have relations both with Iran and the United States. So they're very, interesting cases. One thing that, makes me think about is the persistence of this popular empowerment. That obviously it's not going away. It is possibly getting more powerful and more intense, which then makes me think of other countries in the region who maybe assume that, that was a wave that passed, and this certainly is not the case. A second point, which is interesting, and we hinted at it a bit before, and Randa talked about it, is this revolt is in Iran's sphere of influence. The previous two waves sort of had nothing to do with Iran at all. They were sort of Arab dictatorships, Sunni, if you want to call them that. This is the first, it's not coordinated, but it happens at the same time, that the two countries with the deepest Iranian influence are the ones that are in deepest revolution. This obviously must be very concerning for Iran, and we see how they're trying to change the narrative. But I also think that a lot of Iranians who revolted several times in smaller maybe numbers, and there's still a lot of protests in Iran, must be looking to Iraq and Lebanon and feeling that, this might be something that's relative to them. A third reflection that concerns me a lot is relating to the forms of government, that what is being pushed today in much of the Middle East is a dictatorial, authoritarian, top-down system. That's what China proposes. That's already what a lot of Arab countries move towards. The countries that were somewhat democratic, like Turkey, is also moving in that direction. And it's very concerning to me that two of the countries, Tunis is another case altogether, but two of the countries in which at least there's a fair amount of electoral life. It's a multi-party system. There's a fair amount of freedom. Of course, there's guns and militias and all of that they have gotten so profoundly mired in systemic corruption and have really no credibility. And it's not possible, as Randa mentioned earlier, to see how the system itself can change its ways. And that's very concerning to me because it favors the alternative of having an authoritarian government. And so, if 16 years after the removal of Saddam, this is where Iraq is, with oil wealth and friendships around the world, something's wrong, obviously.
And 16 years after removal of Saddam, you have protesters now, some of the protesters and some people on social media basically saying, we need somebody like Saddam. And also we heard something like that in Lebanon when at some point during the protest, people were saying, maybe we need the army to take over. I think that was also a concerning development for me when I heard some of the Lebanese protesters or some of the people who are not in the protest saying we need a strong hand to take over, both from the corrupt elite that have been governing this country, but at the same time to rein in the protest. So there is this tendency in Arab publics at some point when the democratic process becomes messy, and by its nature, it's messy. It's going to go up and down. It can result in some successes here, in some failure there, but that's the nature of political participation and going by the will of the people, that there is this tendency always in Arab publics of falling back on strong leaders. And that's, That's worrying.
Very concerning. But I wanted to mention something, that struck me about the current Lebanese situation, and maybe is relevant in the Iraqi situation, that these massive moments of public awakening and public mobilization, and I take, for example, the Lebanese case, the protesters have refused to decide on or put forward a leadership or any form of organized coordination, centralization with a leadership. Now, I understand that. It is a public movement. Nobody wants anybody to sort of take advantage of it in any way. It's very sort of egalitarian. But what I'm talking about is, at the end of the day, this movement has to be translated into a political movement that can win elections. Because if all it does is come to the streets every few years, but leaves the political system for the corrupt politicians and does not contest that to me is a profound failure. And in order to begin contesting for elections and so on, there needs to be a using of this opportunity to put forward leaders. It could be a large number of leaders, new faces with new capacities, get them before the public, get them to have traction, and connect them to a national organization so that the movement with its leaders can get somewhere. And perhaps in the Iraqi case as well, all of these parties have won elections and they have different blocs in parliament. It's time for this awakened young generation to figure out how to organize politically and how to win elections effectively.
And in fact, that's a problem of the revolution in Egypt when it happened. I think part, in my opinion, of its failure, or if it is inability to lead to the objective that it put forward to, is that at least the young people, I'm not talking about the Islamist cadre within that revolution, but the young people could not get together and put this leadership core. They could articulate a platform of objective, but again, they could not, as Paul very well said, they did not provide this leadership core to go ahead and contest elections and develop the political machinery to win elections, But after all, they are going against parties that have been in power for a very long time. They have very entrenched political machineries. They know how to play the game. They know how to milk the system and and they are going to resist any attempts at moving out of power. They're not going to give up power easily. So the only way you are going to force them, to change initially, if not to move out, is by contesting the political space through legal and constitutional measures.
We'll have to leave things there. But Randa, Paul, thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us on your podcast, sir.
Thank you very much, Alistair.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.